This recording is the autonomic nervous system. When we talk about the autonomic nervous system, this is the part of the nervous system that is responsible for sending motor information to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Looking at the flow chart on the upper right-hand side of the screen, we can see the central nervous system, which is the brain and the spinal cord, communicates with the peripheral nervous system, taking incoming sensory information, which you can see in the light blue arrow at the top, and sending out descending motor information in that kind of salmon-colored arrow going to the right. The peripheral nervous system has sensory input, which we refer to as the sensory division. And we know that that information is ascending and afferent, whereas the motor division of the peripheral nervous system is going to send descending efferent motor information. The motor information that is sent by the peripheral nervous system can be further broken down into the somatic nervous system, which we already discussed as that part of our peripheral nervous system responsible for initiating voluntary skeletal muscle contraction, and the autonomic nervous system, which is responsible for the contraction of smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The autonomic nervous system is further broken down into a sympathetic division, which is going to be motor response to a circumstance of fight or flight. The parasympathetic division is going to send motor information to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands when the circumstances allow us to do food, mood, feed, breed, or rest and digest. If we look at the picture on the left, you'll notice that the communication for the autonomic nervous system occurs at the level of the subconscious because we don't have to think about it, which is a good thing. So this subconscious communication is going to take place between the frontal lobe of the cerebral cortex, the limbic system, which handles emotional input. And one of the things that's really important for you to understand is that the hypothalamus, which you already know is critical in regulating homeostasis, in the autonomic nervous system, it is considered the boss of the overall integration of the autonomic nervous system. We also see information involving portions of the brain stem, such as the reticular formation, the cardiovascular and respiratory centers in the medulla oblongata, so that we see things like the regulation of the size of our pupils, the regulation of the force of contraction and the rate of contraction of the heart, as well as blood pressure, the rate of breathing and depth of breathing, which can adjust the amount of airflow into our lungs. Salivation. These are all different types of responses, and the spinal cord also will help initiate reflexes for the autonomic nervous system that include those reflexes for urination, defecation, erection, and ejaculation. In looking at the differences between the somatic and autonomic nervous systems, we know that the somatic nervous system consists of one lower motor neuron going to a specific skeletal muscle, which is voluntary, and we know that the soma, or cell body of that efferent neuron, is going to reside in the anterior horn of gray matter. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, now we have two lower motor neurons. One is referred to as being preganglionic, and the second lower motor neuron in the autonomic nervous system is postganglionic. Preganglionic means it's before a ganglion. Postganglionic means that it has its cell body or soma in a ganglion and goes away from it. So the cell body of the preganglionic neuron is going to be in the lateral horn of gray matter. I did mention that earlier, so hopefully it rings a bell. And the cell body of the postganglionic neuron, as I just mentioned, is going to be in a ganglion. Again, the autonomic nervous system is responsible for innervating smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. Again, the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system include the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. We already said that sympathetic was fight or flight. Parasympathetic, I always say food, mood, feed, breed, rest, and digest. So there's one of the three that I mentioned, the rest and digest. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to be initiated when a person is excited, when that individual is exercising, or in the event of an emergency, like running away from a bear. Because of the initiation of the sympathetic nervous system, the person would probably experience a rapid heart rate, shallow breathing, pupils dilate so they can let more light in to see where they're running when they're running away from the bear, and they'll experience dry mouth and probably have sweat coming from their sudoriferous sweat glands. When we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, rest and digest, food, mood, feed, breed, this is where we see digestion, defecation, diuresis, and if you're not familiar with defecation, I'll use the word pooping. Diuresis, peeing, okay? And this is where we see a regular heartbeat, normal breathing, and constricted pupils. Because if a person's resting, that person doesn't need a light going into his eyes to stimulate him. The pupils will actually constrict as he rests. Let's take a look at the different neurotransmitters released by the somatic and autonomic nervous systems. We already know that the somatic nervous system has one lower motor neuron that will release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine at its synaptic end bulbs at the myoneural junction or neuromuscular junction. And we know that the acetylcholine receptors on the motor end plate of the sarcolemma of the muscle fiber will respond in a manner that is excitatory or stimulatory. Whenever you see the plus sign, that means it's going to lead to excitation or stimulation. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, which is motor to smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands, now we have two lower motor neurons. Now, I want to explain something to you because on this portion of the picture, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic, and you can see preganglionic, postganglionic, preganglionic, postganglionic neurons. However, it doesn't appear that there's a postganglionic neuron for this preganglionic neuron. And this is what I wanted to explain to you. There is a special nerve that goes to the adrenal glands. It's called the thoracic splanchnic nerve. And the adrenal glands, like many organs in the body, have an outer cortex, the adrenal cortex, and an inner medullary portion called the adrenal medulla. Now this thoracic splanchnic nerve actually goes into the adrenal medulla, where it will synapse with modified postganglionic neurons. You can see these little green triangles. Those are modified postganglionic neurons called chromaffin cells or medullary chromaffin cells. And those medullary chromaffin cells are going to produce and release the neurotransmitters epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream for a prolonged effect of the sympathetic nervous system. That's why it takes people longer to calm down when they get really excited or nervous or angry, or if they're running away from a bear. So one of the things that's important for you to remember about this particular slide is that all preganglionic neurons, whether it's the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system or the parasympathetic division of the nervous system, all preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine. However, with the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, postganglionic neurons from everything but the adrenal medulla will only release norepinephrine, whereas the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system releases acetylcholine. The preganglionic neurons are very consistent, and that's why I really want you to know what they release. It's easier to remember that one thing, right? All preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine. Okay, remember that the effects on smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and gland is going to be dependent on how the receptors respond. It's not according to the neurotransmitter, it's according to how the receptors respond. Now, some people think that when one system is stimulated, the other system or other organs just shut down. Organs never really shut down. They're going to slow down their activity, and they may do so dramatically, but they never really stop completely. That's not true. So let's look at what happens in a sympathetic fight-flight response. If we look at the sympathetic nervous system, if a bear walks by my picnic table, I'm probably going to have an emotional response where my heart rate is going to increase. Now, if I was eating a chicken salad sandwich at that picnic table, and I'm putting a plus sign next to the heart because the heart rate is going to increase. If I was eating a chicken salad sandwich at the picnic table before the bear showed up, that means that once the bear shows up, my digestive activity is not important. My salivary gland activity is not important. So even though the neurotransmitter norepinephrine is released during sympathetic activity, the effects are different because of the receptors on the glands and organs that are receiving the neurotransmitters or cardiac muscle. Now, after I've calmed down and I'm back to eating my chicken salad sandwich, say I grabbed it before I ran away from the bear, so I still had it in my hand. Once I can calm down and start eating again, well, now I'm back to a parasympathetic activity: food, mood, feed, breathe, rest, and digest. So now my salivary glands can pick up in their activity. I'm writing little plus signs to denote increased activity, which would be true in the intestines and the stomach. And my heart rate is now going to decrease in the presence of the acetylcholine, because that's how the receptors on these effectors respond. See, acetylcholine is released in a parasympathetic response, but different things happen according to the receptors on the smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands, and that's what determines the response. It's the receptors, it's not the neurotransmitter. Even in this slide picture, you can see that it says very clearly stimulatory or inhibitory, depending on, I know it says neurotransmitter, but it's really the receptors. It's the receptors on the effector organs that are going to determine whether or not we have stimulation or inhibition. So please know that. It really depends on the receptors. Got it? Got it. When we look at the autonomic nervous system, understand that organs and glands and the heart have dual innervation, which means that there are two opposing systems innervating one organ, helping to maintain homeostasis. There are three exceptions to this rule. In the skin, our blood vessels, and the adrenal medulla, we only have sympathetic nerves in those structures. So dual innervation for most of the body with the exception of our skin, blood vessels, and the adrenal medulla. This picture is really good because it demonstrates the sympathetic nervous system as emanating from the spinal cord at the levels of T1 to L2, and is sometimes referred to as the thoracolumbar division of the autonomic nervous system for that reason. Whereas the parasympathetic nervous system includes cranial nerves and sacral nerves, and the parasympathetic nervous system being around, that's what para means, around the sympathetic, is sometimes also referred to as the craniosacral division of the autonomic nervous system. That's where those names originated. Another thing that you can see on this picture is both lower motor neurons, because remember, for the autonomic nervous system we have two lower motor neurons. The preganglionic neurons are identified in darker colors, and the postganglionic neurons are identified in lighter colors. So we see long preganglionic neurons for the parasympathetic nervous system, whereas the sympathetic nervous system has short preganglionic neurons. Then in the parasympathetic nervous system, since the preganglionic neurons are long, the postganglionic neurons are short. In the sympathetic nervous system, since the preganglionic neurons are short, the postganglionic neurons tend to be long. Now, as you can imagine, this would be a great test question, right? So if you can figure out one, because everything would be opposite to that one that you figured out, then you know everything by just remembering one. My favorite is that I remember sympathetic, short, pre. Sympathetic, short, pre. So if my sympathetic nervous system has short preganglionic neurons, that means it's going to have long postganglionic neurons. And then the parasympathetic is just the opposite. The pre are long, the post are short, which you can see in this picture. If you remember one and know that everything is going to be opposite in that system, and then the opposite system is opposite to that, you can pretty much figure anything out. We previously mentioned that the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system is sometimes referred to as the thoracolumbar division because it goes from T1 to L2 in terms of the areas of the spinal cord where the neurons emanate. The preganglionic neurons tend to be short. The soma for these neurons, which is the cell bodies, tend to live in the lateral horn of gray matter. The postganglionic neurons tend to be long, and their soma, or cell bodies, will reside in either the sympathetic chain, also known as the sympathetic trunk, also known as the paravertebral ganglia, because these ganglia are found around the sides of the vertebrae. Now, on this particular picture, the preganglionic neurons are solid. The postganglionic neurons have lines that are dashed. So we have short, solid preganglionic neurons. And the axons of some of these preganglionic neurons will not synapse in the sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk ganglia. Their axons will actually go through those structures, exiting them and merging to form special nerves that we call splanchnic nerves. The splanchnic nerves that have axons of preganglionic neurons are going to synapse with postganglionic neurons whose soma or cell bodies reside in a different ganglion that is called a collateral or prevertebral ganglion. Here's one of those, the celiac ganglion. Here's another, the superior mesenteric ganglion. Here's the inferior mesenteric ganglion. It's from these ganglia that the soma for the postganglionic neuron is found, and then its axon will exit that ganglion going to the organ. So we know that the preganglionic neurons have their soma or cell bodies in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So here we have our soma or neuron cell body residing in the lateral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord. It has an axon that's going to exit through the ventral root, because we always motor out the front door to catch the bus. This joins the spinal nerve and enters into the sympathetic chain or sympathetic trunk, and it can do this at the same level that it exited the spinal cord. It enters through a structure called the white ramus communicans. That's how we get to the sympathetic chain ganglia or sympathetic chunk ganglia, also known as the paravertebral ganglia. Now, once it gets into the ganglion, it can synapse with a postganglionic, or some books just say ganglionic, neuron, where the soma or cell body is found in the ganglion. From this point, this neuron has an axon that's going to go through a structure that's different than what you see in this picture. The picture is wrong. Sorry. So the axon is actually going to exit, I'll see if I can do little dashes for you, through this structure here. This structure is the gray ramus communicans. So preganglionic axons enter the sympathetic chain ganglia through the white ramus communicans. The postganglionic axons exit through the gray ramus communicans. That picture is wrong. From the gray ramus communicans, there are two other structures. The dorsal ramus, which serves skin and skeletal muscles to the back of the body, which would be totally somatic motor, right? Skin and skeletal muscles, okay, as well as sensory, because we can get sensations from the skin in our back. But that's skin and skeletal muscles of the back. You have no stomach on the back of your body. And then this branch right here, so this is just the dorsal ramus. Okay, this structure right here is the ventral ramus. The ventral ramus is going to supply not only the skin and skeletal muscles on the sides and front of the body, but it can also carry the sympathetic information from the sympathetic trunk ganglia to a lot of different organs in the body. Okay, that is option number one. Stick with me. Option number two is that when a preganglionic axon enters through the white ramus communicans into the sympathetic chain ganglia, it can synapse with a postganglionic neuron at any different level. This allows for widespread sympathetic information to be sent to our organs and to our body so that we can have a very quick, rapid sympathetic nervous system response, which could be life-saving if you have to run away from the bear. So that is option number two. It can go in through the white ramus. They actually did the picture correctly on here because they've got the postganglionic axon exiting through the gray ramus communicans. Oh, by the way, easy way to remember this in lab is that the gray matter of the spinal cord is on the inside and the white matter is on the outside. Well, the gray ramus communicans is more medial on the inside and the white ramus communicans is on the outside or lateral. Okay, another option that can occur is something that happens when the axon of the preganglionic neuron, remember axons are sometimes referred to as fibers, so we see that, and that axon, as it goes out through the ventral root, through the spinal nerve, can enter the sympathetic trunk ganglion, but then exit to form a splanchnic nerve that will form a synapse with a postganglionic neuron that's found in the collateral or prevertebral ganglia. So option number one, information goes in, goes out at the same level. Remember that this picture is incorrect. It doesn't go out where it appears to in the picture. It goes out through the dorsal, through the gray ramus communicans. That's option number one. Information comes in through the white ramus communicans, synapses at the same level. Postganglionic neuron has an axon that exits through the gray ramus communicans and then eventually goes out through the ventral ramus. Option number two, preganglionic axon enters through the white ramus communicans to get into the sympathetic chain. It can go either up or down, and they often do go up and down, and synapse with postganglionic neurons at other levels, at which case, again, their axons will exit through the gray ramus communicans and then go out through the ventral ramus to a target effector. And then option number three is the axon of the preganglionic neuron goes out through the ventral root, in through the white ramus communicans, and then back out from the sympathetic chain ganglia to form a splanchnic nerve which will later synapse with a postganglionic neuron in the prevertebral ganglia, okay, otherwise known as collateral ganglia. Remember, the term ganglion is singular, ganglia is plural. This takes us to our adrenal glands. We know that the sympathetic nervous system is going to have a thoracic splanchnic nerve that directly goes into the adrenal medulla. This picture is great because you can actually see it going into the adrenal medulla, stimulating those adrenal medulla chromaffin cells, which are modified postganglionic neurons to release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the bloodstream to circulate through the entire body, thereby prolonging and enhancing the effects of the sympathetic nervous system, which is why it takes people a while to calm down. By the way, when you see the word adrenaline or noradrenaline, adrenaline is basically the same thing as epinephrine. Noradrenaline is the same thing as norepinephrine. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are very similar molecules. They do have a slight difference in their configuration, therefore they have different names, and the effects do vary slightly in certain areas of the body. Again, you'll get to more of that when you hit the endocrine system. Here we can see the situation of the location of the adrenal glands where they are superior to the kidneys. So the effects of the sympathetic nervous system are widespread. These include the breakdown of fat molecules for energy and the production of adenosine triphosphate. The erector pili muscles in the dermis of the skin will contract, raising the pili, the hairs on the surface of the skin. Blood vessels in the skin constrict, and in skeletal muscle they relax, allowing better blood flow to skeletal muscles, bringing oxygen and nutrients so that we can more effectively run away from the bear. The pupils will dilate so we can see better and farther, so we know where to run away from the bear. The adrenal medulla will secrete epinephrine and norepinephrine in order that we have this prolonged effect of the sympathetic nervous system. The stomach activity slows dramatically. It's not important for me to worry about digesting the chicken salad sandwich I was eating when I need to run away from the bear. The salivary gland activity will also slow dramatically because I'm not going to sit around chomping on a sandwich when a bear shows up. The heart rate and overall blood pressure will increase. The force of the contraction of the heart also increases during sympathetic nervous stimulation. The liver will break down glycogen into glucose so it can be used to produce more adenosine triphosphate. The kidneys slow down dramatically in producing urine. The body sees an overall increase in metabolism because more adenosine triphosphate is going to be needed. And the bronchioles, which are the little branches coming off of branches that take air to the lungs called bronchi, that come off the trachea, which you know is your windpipe, are going to dilate. The bronchioles are going to dilate and open up so you can get more air in so you can run away from the bear. And then the activity in the intestines is also going to slow down dramatically. I don't need to worry about processing the part of the chicken salad sandwich I got to eat before the bear showed up. I need to worry about running away from the bear. The parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system we already know is sometimes referred to as the craniosacral division based on the location of the soma or neuron cell bodies. We know that there are soma or cell bodies that reside in the brainstem or in spinal segments from S2 to S4. And we also know that the axons of the preganglionic neurons tend to be long, whereas the axons of the postganglionic neurons are short. There are two different types of ganglia involved in the parasympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. For cranial nerves 3, 7, and 9, we see terminal ganglia. The terminal ganglia include the otic ganglion, the submandibular ganglion, the pterygopalatine ganglion, and the ciliary ganglion. These ganglia have soma or cell bodies belonging to the postganglionic neurons with short axons that are going to go to their target effectors. That's one type of ganglia involved in the parasympathetic division. For cranial nerve 10 and the sacral spinal segments, we see axons of preganglionic neurons that go pretty much to the organ. And what we can't see is that there is another type of ganglia that's embedded in the wall of the organ, and that's where the postganglionic neurons are. Because the ganglia are located in the walls of these organs, they're referred to as intramural ganglia. Okay, so those are in the walls of target organs. So we have terminal ganglia for basically the eyes and the salivary glands, located here. And then we have intramural ganglia. Intramural means within the walls, for other organs involved with cranial nerve 10, which is vagus, and spinal segments S2 to S4. One way to remember which is which, and I think I've said this before, and it might be helpful for you for lab, is I always remember that if I go to the bus terminal first, that's where I see the murals on the wall. So I have to get to the bus terminal first, and so terminal ganglia, if I go from superior to inferior, I see terminal ganglia first before seeing the intramural ganglia on the walls of the organs. When we look at the neurons that produce acetylcholine, those neurons are referred to as having cholinergic fibers. In other words, at the end of the axon, acetylcholine is released. So our preganglionic neurons in the parasympathetic division of the nervous system and our preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic nervous system have fibers that are cholinergic because they release acetylcholine. The receptor on the postganglionic neuron is going to be a nicotinic receptor. Technically, it's a nicotinic cholinergic receptor. Nicotinic cholinergic receptors are always going to respond in an excitatory fashion. The postganglionic neuron in the parasympathetic nervous system also releases acetylcholine. Therefore, the axon of the second neuron is a cholinergic fiber. And the receptors for the target organs for the parasympathetic nervous system are referred to as muscarinic cholinergic receptors. Muscarinic cholinergic receptors can either be excitatory or inhibitory. And there's more to the story than this, but that's as far as we're going to go for this class. That's as much as you need, okay? In the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system, we can see that the preganglionic neurons are going to release acetylcholine at the end of their axon. That makes those preganglionic neurons cholinergic because their fibers are cholinergic fibers. They release acetylcholine at their synaptic end bulbs. The receptors on the postganglionic neurons are, again, going to be nicotinic cholinergic receptors, and they will always be stimulated by the release of acetylcholine. However, postganglionic neurons are going to release norepinephrine. Therefore, their axons, their fibers, are referred to as being adrenergic. And the receptors on target organs for norepinephrine are alpha and beta adrenergic receptors. Again, they may or may not be stimulating the target organ or effector depending on how the receptors, the alpha and beta adrenergic receptors, respond. So, looking at some of the differences again, anatomical and physiological differences between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. Just so you know, pathos means feeling. So I guess that's a good feeling: food, mood, feed, breed, rest, digest. Whereas sym means together. And so when we look at the parasympathetic nervous system, remember craniosacral, brainstem nuclei involved, cranial nerves 3, 7, 9, and 10, and spinal cord segments S2 to S4, whereas sympathetic is thoracolumbar, where the soma of the neurons reside in the lateral horns of gray matter of the spinal cord from segments T1 to L2. The ganglia involved in the parasympathetic nervous system include the terminal ganglia, and then within the walls of the organs we see intramural ganglia. However, with the sympathetic nervous system, remember we've got the sympathetic trunk or sympathetic chain ganglia, as well as the collateral or prevertebral ganglia. And I did not do the other two names of the sympathetic trunk ganglia, which would be sympathetic chain or paravertebral ganglia, not to be confused with prevertebral ganglia. In terms of the length of the axons, their fibers, remember sympathetic short pre. That means their postganglionic fibers are long. That means the parasympathetic is opposite. It's going to have long preganglionic axons, short postganglionic axons. Again, if you know one of these, you can figure out the rest. Let's see. We have the gray and white rami communicantes or communicans, same thing. For the sympathetic nervous system, for the preganglionic axons to either enter into the sympathetic chain or trunk or pass through in order to get in. Remember, they enter in the white rami communicans, which by the way is myelinated, and that's why it appears white. The preganglionic fibers are myelinated. The gray rami communicantes or communicans have non-myelinated postganglionic fibers. In terms of branching of preganglionic fibers, minimal for parasympathetic, extensive for sympathetic. In terms of functional roles, it's basically maintaining functions, conserving and storing energy food, mood, feed, breed, rest, and digest. In terms of sympathetic, we know that it prepares the body for activity, exercise, fight, or flight. Neurotransmitters, we know all pre- and post-ganglionic fibers in the parasympathetic nervous system release acetylcholine, therefore they are cholinergic fibers. And for sympathetic nervous system, all pre-ganglionic fibers release acetylcholine. Most post-ganglionic fibers are going to release norepinephrine, and the post-ganglionic fibers that serve the sweat glands actually release acetylcholine, and the neurotransmitter activity can be augmented by the release of hormones known as epinephrine and norepinephrine that come from the adrenal medulla. By the way, sometimes you'll see hormones, sometimes you'll see the term neurotransmitter when these chemicals are being described. Either one is technically correct for these. This takes us to autonomic varicosities. These are connections between postsynaptic neurons and their target effector. It's not a typical synapse. A varicosity is simply a swelling, and we see these postganglionic varicosities along the length of smooth muscle where they have neurotransmitter-filled synaptic vesicles that will be released in synapses close to the sarcolemma of the smooth muscle. And so there's no synaptic end bulb. Instead, the neurotransmitters are being released along the length of the fiber, and that makes an extended network of connections. When we talk about the reflexes involved between somatic reflexes versus visceral reflexes, we know that somatic reflexes can involve a direct connection from the ventral horn of gray matter to skeletal muscle, because that's where the neuron cell bodies or soma reside, in the ventral horn of gray matter in the spinal cord, and that will go directly to skeletal muscles. And the weird thing is on this lower picture where they're showing that, they put the neuron cell body closer to the lateral horn of gray matter. In fact, they put it in the exact same spot as they did for the one for the autonomic efferent pathway. So there's another error on a picture. Visceral reflexes are going to involve preganglionic neurons from the lateral horn synapsing with a postganglionic neuron in a ganglion and at the and ending at that target organ. So there are somatic reflexes and visceral reflexes. So there's no ganglion involved in a somatic reflex. There's a synapse with a postganglionic neuron in a visceral reflex. There are actually two different types of reflexes that can occur in the autonomic nervous system. A long reflex occurs when a sensory receptor cell sends information through the dorsal root to the posterior horn of gray matter that will eventually synapse with a preganglionic neuron in the lateral horn of gray matter. And that neuron's axon will exit through the ventral root and synapse with a postganglionic neuron in a peripheral ganglion, and then cause a reflex in its target effector. So that is the long reflex. It has to go through the spinal cord, similar to our somatic motor reflexes, which go through the spinal cord. However, the difference being that there are two lower motor neurons involved in the autonomic nervous system. With the short reflex, what's kind of cool here is that information from a sensory receptor cell can actually synapse with a postganglionic neuron directly in a peripheral ganglion. So it doesn't even get to the level of the spinal cord. This takes us to referred pain. When a person experiences strong visceral perceptions that reach our conscious perception, it's not unusual for sensations to be felt in other and sometimes unexpected places. And this is what we refer to as visceral referred pain. Heart pain is often found in the left shoulder and can also radiate down the medial portion of the left arm, but can also be felt in the jaw on the left side. I'm doing both sides, but it's technically the left side. And this is a phenomenon that occurs because visceral sensory fibers enter the same level of the spinal cord as the somatosensory fibers from the referred pain location. So looking at some of these referred pain patterns, it's kind of interesting. We also see the heart in the back with a referred pain pattern here. You can see the extensive referred pain pattern that is involved with kidney pain. Look at the dark brown area that kind of forms a blanket or pair of shorts almost for referred kidney pain. So some of these areas are very, very large when we think about it. Even the lungs and the diaphragm can refer pain to the neck and the shoulders. The size of our pupils is under autonomic control, and that control is activated according to the amount of light that is present that activates the ganglion cells in the retina that are going to send signals to the primary visual cortex of the brain. And if dim light is perceived, then the sympathetic nervous system will send a signal that releases norepinephrine onto the radial fibers of the iris that cause the pupil to dilate, allowing more light to enter. Because if it's dim, we need as much light as possible to get into the eye so we can see better. In bright light, the parasympathetic system will send a signal that releases acetylcholine onto the circular fibers of the iris, which will cause the pupil to constrict. If you've ever seen a first responder or doctor shine a pen light into a patient's eye, and he'll probably test one eye and then test the other eye, what that person's checking for is known as a pupillary reflex. And when the light hits the retina in one eye, both pupils should contract equally, and when the light is removed, they should both dilate back to their resting position. Even though the stimulus is unilateral, it causes a bilateral response, which is not true for somatic reflexes. In a somatic reflex, if you burn your hand, you'll take that one hand away. You won't take two hands away if you burn one hand. So there's a reason this occurs, and basically it's because that as action potentials travel from the optic nerve across the optic chiasma, they're going to reach both the right and left sides of the brain because of the optic chiasma. There are fibers crossing, and that in turn stimulates nuclei in the midbrain. There's a special area called the Edinger-Westphal nucleus. You don't need to know that. And both sides of that will be stimulated, and that's why the Edinger-Westphal nucleus will then generate action potentials causing both pupils to constrict. That's more information than you need to know, but that's pretty much why it happens. It's because both sides of the brain perceive the light. It's going to stimulate both sides of the brain to have a response for pupillary constriction. Just like we had tracts of fibers or axons in the somatic motor system, we also have fiber tracts for the autonomic nervous system. And one of the important things to get from this slide is that the hypothalamus is the source of most of the control, central control of the autonomic nervous system. And the hypothalamus will receive input from cerebral structures and will project them to the brainstem and the spinal cord to help regulate balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic input to organs. The main pathways for these tracts are called the medial forebrain bundle and the dorsal longitudinal fasciculus. And we can see these here. And you can see also how they continue in different areas of the brain. We know that the autonomic nervous system is dependent on emotion and involves the limbic system. One of the parts of the limbic system is a particular structure called the amygdala. The amygdala is a group of nuclei that's located in the temporal lobe and is part of the limbic system. This group of nuclei respond to stimuli that would cause a person to feel fearful or anxious or scared, and it sends signals to the hypothalamus to stimulate that fight-flight response and release stress hormones into the blood as well. Oddly enough, and I don't know if I told you this before, but they did a study on serial killers, and serial killers have a very small developed amygdala. It's very small compared to a normal amygdala, and they don't fear getting caught. When we talk about other structures that are involved in the autonomic nervous system in terms of regulation, we know that the medulla oblongata has cardiovascular centers as well as respiratory rhythmicity centers. And this helps the cardiovascular center helps control smooth and cardiac muscle of the cardiovascular system. And there are cardiac accelerator nerves and sympathetic fibers that help increase the heart rate, as well as fibers that increase the force of contraction of the heart. Vasomotor nerves will cause constriction of blood vessels because blood vessels have sympathetic innervation, they don't have parasympathetic innervation. Blood vessels relax when sympathetic nervous system signals are ended. Drugs can be used to influence the effective neurotransmitters from the autonomic nervous system or mimic them or block effects sometimes. Sympathomimetic drugs or adrenergic drugs mimic the effects of the sympathetic division of the autonomic nervous system. Phenylephrine, found in decongestants, is also used to dilate the pupils. Someone who has asthma may be given adrenergic drugs to help dilate or open up those passageways for air to get in. And in the slide it says, what other side effects might this cause elsewhere in the body? Well, anything that's going to be a sympathomimetic is going to increase heart rate and increase blood pressure as well. So when somebody suffers from severe allergies, maybe to peanuts, and has an anaphylactic response, that person very well may be carrying an epinephrine pen or an EpiPen. Again, it helps to open up the airways so the person can breathe. The only problem is it increases the heart rate dramatically as well as the blood pressure. Sympatholytic drugs are drugs that will stop a sympathetic type of response in the body. And when we look at the word lytic, that comes from lysis, to break or burst apart. So it's basically stopping the sympathetic response. Beta blockers are a great example of this because they dilate blood vessels by preventing them from constricting. Because remember, blood vessels do not have a parasympathetic innervation. They only have sympathetic. They can only constrict. So if we give an individual beta blockers, that will allow his blood vessels to remain open at a normal size. Beta blockers are also good for keeping the heart rate from increasing. Additional pharmacological applications include parasympathomimetic drugs or cholinergic drugs. Now, whenever you see mimetic, it's going to mimic. So it's going to mimic the effects of the parasympathetic nervous system. There are also parasympatholytic drugs, which would prevent the parasympathetic nervous system from having its effects. So atropine is a drug that blocks the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, if we didn't have a parasympathetic nervous system or a sympathetic nervous system, our heart would beat at about 100 beats per minute, because the heart it will stimulate itself to beat, okay? It's actually the parasympathetic nervous system by way of the vagus nerve that slows the heart down to a normal rate of approximately 68 to 70 beats per minute. So if atropine blocks the parasympathetic nervous system from slowing down the heart rate to what we consider as normal, then atropine would allow the heart rate to increase. What would it do to our pupil size? Well, if our parasympathetic nervous system constricts the pupils, then atropine would dilate them. Morphine is a parasympathomimetic. So the morphine side effects, which you can see on this chart, include miosis, which is an abnormal constriction of the pupil, feeling out of it, having depression of the respiratory system, so it's harder to breathe, pneumonia, hypotension, which is low blood pressure, infrequency, which can either lead to holding on to too much urine, which they call urinary retention, or constipation, nausea, and emesis, which is vomiting. This takes us to one of the homeostatic imbalances of the autonomic nervous system. Most disorders will reflect an either exaggerated or deficient ability to control smooth muscle activity. Hypertension can cause high blood pressure due to an overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor response. Raynaud's disease includes intermittent attacks that cause the skin and the fingers and the toes of those extremities to become first pale, then cyanotic, which is having a bluish appearance, and then very painful. And this is just an exaggerated vasoconstriction response. Autonomic neuropathy is damage to autonomic nerves, and it's a common complication with diabetes mellitus. The earliest symptoms are going to include sexual dysfunction, and many males will experience erectile dysfunction, and females experience things like reduced lubrication of the vagina. And other symptoms include things like dizziness on standing because they can't control their blood pressure, and urinary incontinence, slow pupillary reactions, impaired ability to sweat. And this is why it's so important to maintain glucose levels, because remember, if there's too much sugar in the blood because the body gets bombarded with dietary intake of sugar, that actually causes insulin receptors on the surfaces of our cells to go, eh, and they hide. And the cells become less responsive to insulin. And then there's a buildup of sugar in the blood because it can't go from the bloodstream to the cells to be used for energy. And so as sugar accumulates in the bloodstream, it makes blood sticky. Imagine if you poured a can of Coke on the floor and just left it there and left it evaporate a little bit, it would stick because of the sugar. And so the red blood cells become sticky, the walls of the arteries, the arterioles, the capillaries become sticky, and it's harder for blood to flow. And when it's harder for blood to flow, that means nerves can't get the blood, the oxygen, and the nutrients that they need to remain healthy. So that's what causes diabetic neuropathy, and it causes a whole host of problems throughout the body. It's not just going to affect nerves, it's going to affect other organs and tissues as well. Autonomic dysreflexia. I'm going to take myself off of here so you can see this slide a little better. This is a problem that can occur in people who have injuries of the spinal cord above the level of T6, and what happens is it leads to uncontrolled activation of the autonomic neurons. And it's usually triggered by very, very painful stimulus or an overfilled visceral organ, such as the bladder or the stomach, or sometimes even urinary stones can cause autonomic dysreflexia, or constipation, hemorrhoids. Sometimes the skin with a pressure ulcer or tight clothing or an ingrown toenail or blisters or burn, or compression of the scrotum, even sometimes sexual stimulation or childbirth or labor and menstruation. Any kind of condition that could potentially cause abdominal pain can trigger autonomic dysreflexia. And with this, the blood pressure can go up higher than normal, sometimes more than 30 millimeters of mercury above normal. And that increase in blood pressure can potentially lead to stroke. The person may have abnormal sweating, feel flushed, a really pounding headache because of the high blood pressure, have a tight chest, stuffy nose, blurred vision, and it really requires emergency treatment for the individual. So it's really, really important to get a person who's experiencing autonomic dysreflexia some immediate care. Some of the complications of aging in the autonomic nervous system include things like constipation, because as people get older, and especially with diabetics, their autonomic nervous system is not going to work as well. And add to that the fact that they may not be eating properly or getting enough fluid or exercising enough. Those are all things that would help prevent constipation, but most people as they age tend to not do those things. Elderly people also tend to experience dry eyes and have more frequent eye infections. They may also experience something called orthostatic hypotension, which is low blood pressure that occurs due to changes in position. So if somebody's laying down and he gets up too quickly, there's aging in the heart, so it doesn't contract as efficiently, and also less responsive receptors. Remember that the carotid sinus is the area of the carotid artery that helps monitor blood pressure. That's where baroreceptors are found. So if a person gets up and his blood pressure for the carotid arteries taking blood to the brain drops, that's usually detected quickly by the carotid sinus, which sends signals back so that the heart can contract more forcefully and more rapidly to get blood back up to the brain. And so that orthostatic hypotension is something that can occur also with aging. So this is the last slide for this semester. I hope that you've enjoyed the series. I hope it's been helpful.